This is the beginning of Media 4. The time is 1:55 p.m. We're back on the record.
Good afternoon, Officer Mawhood.
Good afternoon.
We met during Officer Harris's deposition, but for the record, I'll introduce myself as Kimberly Clark. I represent La Estancia Apartments and 2012 Multifamily Real Estate Fund. Do you understand that?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
And you've been going through the course of the deposition for the past few hours, and you understand how the deposition process will work. I'll ask you a question, you'll answer. Let's just try to make sure we don't talk over each other.
Yes, ma'am.
As the court reporter is taking down both of our comments. And also we want the jury to be able to fully hear your answer to whatever I ask. Is that fair?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And if any point during our time here together today, you don't understand a question that I ask, can we make an agreement now that you won't answer that question if you don't understand it?
Yes, ma'am.
And if you don't understand it, will you let me know so that
I will.
can change or rephrase my wording?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. As you know, if you need a break at any point in time, all you have to do is let us know. And if we don't have a question on the table that hasn't been answered, we can take a break. If there is a question on the table, we'll let you finish your response, and then we'll take a break.
Okay.
You testified earlier that you started Academy in June of 1995. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And that was here, the Houston Police Academy. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Have you been a police officer in Houston your entire career?
Yes, ma'am.
I want to talk a little more in detail about your time in Academy so that the jury understands the types of things that you're taught while you're in that period of time with the Academy. Can you explain to the jury what type of training is provided while you're in Academy?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. It's very extensive. You know, the Academy duration period is a 6-month period. It typically starts out with education on the various codes. So, for example, the Penal Code, Code of Criminal Procedure, things of that nature, traffic laws. So we do get good training on book knowledge, if you will, of laws.
Okay.
But it also we also get trained and educated on crime scene management, things like how to take fingerprints, etc. We also get extensive firearms training, driver's training, defensive tactics, and I think that's the primary part.
Okay.
That covers most of the big topics.
Okay, so I want to go back. You mentioned the Penal Code. Help the jury understand what the Penal Code is.
Okay, so it's basically a book of rules, if you will, for society to follow. It basically talks about the laws, what constitutes a criminal infraction, and how a person can be charged based on that infraction, what level of charge, things of that nature.
Okay, and when you say the rules of society, are you meaning that to also equate to laws that are applicable
Yes.
generally in society?
Yes, so the Penal Code would govern the law, the criminal law, the criminally enforceable laws in the state of Texas.
Okay, and when you mentioned earlier the Code of Criminal Procedure, can you help the jury understand what that code is?
Okay, so that's more of a code kind of governing like how law enforcement agencies or police officers will enforce a law, if you will.
Okay, so you have a book that tells you
What the
the
law is.
laws are, and that's the Penal Code.
Correct.
Okay, and then you have this Code of Criminal Procedure that basically kind of tells you how to enforce those laws in the criminal justice system.
For the most part, yes.
For the most part.
Yes, ma'am.
And so that is, those are two things that you're taught while you're in Academy.
That's correct.
Okay. You mentioned firearm training. Take us through what kind of training you're provided.
Okay, well, it's pretty extensive training. We initially start out, well, they of course cover gun safety, and then when we actually get to practical application, there's a lot of target shooting up front, timed target shooting, and then once we get to a certain point beyond that, they'll incorporate some tactical shooting under stress, what they call stress fire.
Okay.
So we can learn how to shoot under a stressful environment.
Okay.
So that's included.
I believe you testified earlier that while you're provided training in academy regarding firearms, you actually had additional training later on in your career with respect to firearms. Is that a correct assessment of your prior testimony?
Yes, ma'am, that is.
What prior or further training did you receive?
So prior to being a part of the warrant team, we were sent to the HPD Tactical School. That is basically training with SWAT officers, and we were taught all kinds of shooting there. That's where I believe the gentleman brought up earlier, shooting from cars. You know, we had a lot of training on that, shooting from cars, running and shooting. Shooting, we practiced shooting also from, if we were ever working from a plainclothes or undercover capacity. So all that was encompassed in that tactical school training.
Okay. Were you, going back to academy now, with respect to your firearm training, were you also provided with training on use of force, when to actually use your firearm?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
We were.
Could you explain to the jury how you were taught about situations where use of force would be necessary?
So back at that time period, I believe the terminology, there was a use of force continuum. I think that terminology has changed now. But what was discussed in use of force was anything from physical use of force on up to lethal use of force.
Okay.
Okay.
So there's a difference.
Yes, ma'am. And there's an intermediate in between.
Okay, so you have use of force where it just would be your physical body, using your physical body as
Yes, ma'am.
force.
That's correct.
And then you have an intermediary, and what's that middle point?
An example of using force on an intermediate scale would be the use of maybe a baton or a taser,
Okay.
something of that nature.
Okay, and then on the other end of the continuum, we have lethal use of force.
That's correct. That's we're taught that, you know, that's used whenever you're faced with imminent bodily injury or death to yourself or someone else.
Okay. How long, the 6-month period in academy, did it have a classroom component and a field component, or was it all together?
No, it was actually in that order. The first 6 months while we're in the academy, that's more outside of, we do like crime scene scenarios, like practicals, if you will. That's all in the academy. So we do the book stuff first, then they give us some practicals. Okay, then when we successfully complete the academy, we do 6 months of field training. So that's actually out in the field riding with a uniformed officer who's a trainer, and we actually put into application what we were taught in the academy.
Okay, so there's like you said earlier, the classroom component where you're taught the book stuff, and then you're put in the field where you have to apply what you learned in the classroom to real life situations. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. How long does the field, in the field component, how long does that last?
I don't know the exact time. 20-something weeks, I think. That can be variable because it depends on how you do. Okay, so you have to pass phases of the field training. So if you don't pass a certain area, it's possible that they can keep you in the field training mode a little bit longer during that probationary period.
Okay.
I didn't have any problems with that. I got through all mine.
Okay.
So.
While you were either in the classroom component or the field component, were you ever taught how to encounter or engage, deal with dangerous individuals?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. What type of training were you provided with respect to those types of suspects you may encounter?
An increased situational awareness of your surroundings, including what the dangerous individual may be capable of doing, whether or not they act out on it or not. It's what they're capable of doing, and that could mean anything: reaching for something, attacking you.
Now, when you were taught how to engage with these individuals, were you taught that you couldn't engage with them until you actually saw them commit a crime, or were you taught otherwise?
No, we were taught otherwise. I mean...
and can you elaborate on how you were taught?
Well, absolutely. For example, use of force, let's say where an officer discharges his firearm. If you have a subject that is making furtive movements, he's not following the verbal commands, he reaches for something, we don't know what he's reaching for. It could be a box of business cards, I don't know, a box of bullets, whatever. Based on their movements, their actions, if there's any possibility that that person could produce a weapon and assault the officer or anyone else, the officer doesn't have to wait to see what it is. The officer could use that level of force, discharging their firearm, to stop a potential threat, even if they end up not having a weapon.
Okay.
Okay.
Were you taught in either academy or any other training you received in your 22 years of experience with the department as to whether, let me backtrack on that question. So throughout your years of training and experience, were you ever taught that you cannot engage an individual? Let's say you're out on patrol and you see furtive movements, or you see reaching in a concealed part of their body. Were you taught that you can keep an eye on them and observe them, and that's not against the law for you to do that?
Absolutely.
Objection leading.
I'm sorry?
Absolutely.
Okay. So if I'm understanding you correctly, you don't have to wait till you see a crime actually committed. You can watch them, observe their mannerisms, and approach if you see anything that could lead to a criminal act.
Objection leading.
Absolutely. It's what we call reasonable suspicion.
Okay. And you testified and used that word earlier. Can you tell the jury what reasonable suspicion means?
Well, it's exactly that. It's actions or behaviors, if you will, that don't necessarily constitute a crime, but that it gives you suspicion that a crime is about to possibly occur.
And when you encounter individuals on the street or patrolling, you don't have to have anything concrete. You can just have that reasonable suspicion that you just testified to engage with them.
Objection leading.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
Leading.
You know, because you can start with something as casual as a consensual encounter, and that's just, there's nothing to prevent us from doing that. We can strike up a conversation, but that can lead to reasonable suspicion. But
During that conversation?
Yes, but we can use reasonable suspicion to also strike up a conversation.
And reasonable suspicion is quite different from probable cause. Is that correct?
It's different. I don't know how different it is. I mean, you can use reasonable suspicion
To lead
to lead to probable cause.
Okay. In order to charge someone, you in fact have to have probable cause. Is that correct?
That's
Leading.
correct.
And in instances where you eventually obtain probable cause, as you just testified, it could have started with reasonable suspicion?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. After you finish the classroom component and the field training component, are you then a licensed peace officer?
Well, so literally the way it works, we do all of the academy training, which I explained earlier. At the end of the academy, when you graduate, that's when you become a sworn police officer. So
Okay.
you're actually a sworn officer going into field training.
Okay. When did you become a sworn licensed peace officer?
December of 1995.
Okay. And after you finished the field training portion of your of academy, what's the next step of training or level of training that you receive?
Well, every year, and I think the Houston Police Department does the best job they can. I think it's pretty good. We're required to do 40 hours of what we call in-service training every year. And we've done that every year since I graduated.
Okay, so you do the time in academy, which is approximately 6 months. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And that includes the classroom and the field. Is that also correct?
Well, the academy involves the book stuff and practicals. That's 6 months. We graduate from there, and then we do so many weeks in the field.
Okay.
Okay, and then when we successfully complete that, we finish our probationary period, and once you're off probation and you go into your first year, that's when the requirement for the ongoing annual in-service training begins.
Okay, got it. And that are those the TCO requirements that you have to adhere to?
They are.
Okay. And if you could, would you tell the jury what TCO actually means? If I
The acronym?
Yes.
Well,
If
when
you don't know.
I came out, it was T-close, so it's changed. But I believe it's something along of the Texas.
If I represented to you that it meant Texas Commission on Law Enforcement, does that sound about right?
Yes, that is
Okay.
correct. That is correct.
I wasn't trying to stump you there.
No. You got it.
So after you finish those weeks in academy and the field training, you are then required to have 40 hours of training every year.
That's correct. And let me just clarify the ongoing 40 hours every year. That's not necessarily a T-close standard. I think T-close only requires half that, but HPD goes above and beyond as far as additional training that they want us to have.
Okay. And so in your 22 years with the department, have you gone above and beyond completing the HPD requirement of 40 hours of continuing education?
Yes, I've done the 40-hour requirement.
Okay.
Some years it's more. It depends on the schools. You can also, an officer can also, if they're interested in a particular avenue, they can sign up for a school. Like, for example, a DWI school. That's not required by the department, but you can take that.
Okay.
Okay, so that would even add to the training.
Well, that leads right into the next line of questioning I have for you. So, have you taken any courses to help lead you to the next avenue in your career?
Well, I did take the DWI school. That was a 40-hour school. That was pretty involved. I've taken, radar school, which is not required. That was my own election. I've taken laser school of my own accord. That was not required. Trying to think what other major schools. Those are the major schools that I think upon my election, and then other schools that I had to take just by going into other positions. Like when I went to DRT, we had a lot of schools. The 40-hour DRT school, CEPTED school, which is Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. That was another lengthy school. the 40-hour crime prevention school, and then a lot of these, or some of these schools will also incorporate other things. Like for example, in DRT, we got a lot of training on community service relations, and then somewhere on the ongoing annual training, required training, we've had a lot of cultural diversity training. Some of that involved communications, things of that nature. So
And with this community relation training and cultural training, what are you being taught with respect to your day-to-day duties?
in those classes, like the community service, cultural diversity, it's really just improving an officer's interpersonal communication skills to work with the community, to work on crime, and to improve the overall quality of life for citizens.
And does it include any training on how to interact with different racial or ethnic communities?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, mainly that was covered under the cultural diversity training.
Okay.
That gave us an opportunity to learn about different cultures and backgrounds, customs, things of that nature.
Okay. Did that include training on how to engage with members of the African American community?
Yes, ma'am.
What about the Hispanic community?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. The Asian community?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So various communities that you serve here in the Houston Metroplex, they provide training on how to engage with those community members?
That's correct.
Is there any racial profiling training included in that?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, that became a formality of law, actually, as far as how we document our interactions on, for example, traffic stops. Okay, and that's more of a formality of what we have to document. But again, going back to the cultural diversity combined with the community service training, it gives a person an opportunity to learn about the different backgrounds and cultures. So what that does is can open up an officer's awareness going into a situation. So a custom or a practice that a certain background has, if you didn't get the training and you're not aware of it, you never lived there, you now have some awareness of where they're coming from, if you will.
Does that improve the relationship with the people that you're engaging with on a daily basis?
Absolutely.
Okay. Have you ever taken any tests in order to try to promote?
No. Yes, I'm sorry. I did take one sergeant's promotional exam just one time. I had a lot going on in my personal life at the time, so I didn't really apply myself as I should have, and then I kind of lost interest after that.
And your current rank or position with the police department, what is that?
Senior police officer.
Okay. And is there any, what basically does a senior police officer, what does that mean?
Other than being old, just time and grade, experience. Okay. We have the ongoing education behind us, and then we also have that many years of actually putting that education into practice on the streets. So,
And that would be different from a rookie officer, the differentiation between
it is, and it's not
senior-
to say that one is better than the other. I think it just states that when you get to senior level status, you may have been exposed to more. You may have been through more experiences where it could ultimately reflect on, things like sound judgment, things of that nature.
Have you ever received any accommodations, awards, or honors for your police work?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Any that you can think of? I'm not asking you over 22 years to list every award or accommodation, but any that, when I ask you that question, that pop off at the top of your head.
Significant ones that come to mind, going way back, we received a service award from City Council person Martha Wong. That was for a very big project that we worked on the Richmond club strip, if you will, over many years, addressing a lot of the, that was a quality of life issue, but it went on for a very prolonged period of time, and so we got a special award from the council for that. I also received a Chief of Police Unit Citation Award for my involvement when the department switched from the old computer systems over to the incorporation of the new RMS system. That was a pretty long, big project. So, and then I got an award for this incident here for just being a part of a hostile engagement situation. And the only reason that's significant is it's just a high-risk situation that we're faced with.
Okay. I don't know if you were asked this question earlier, but I'll ask it. Over your 22 years of service with the department, would you say you've worked off-duty or extra jobs on few or many occasions?
Many.
Many. What types of places would you have actually had this extra employment?
A wide variety. I've
Okay.
worked X jobs at office buildings, restaurants, nightclubs, subdivisions for HOAs, of course apartment complexes, individual events like at churches, fundraising events like I've worked a few for like raising money for breast cancer, things of that nature.
Okay. And when you work those off-duty jobs or extra employment, are you considered an employee of the company you're working for or the entity you're working for, or are you considered an independent contractor?
We're never considered an employee for any of the companies that we work for. We're always considered independent because we are employees, full-time employees for the Houston Police Department. The department doesn't allow us to do that. They will permit us to work in an extra employment capacity, but it's on a contract basis. We're never direct hire, if you will.
And when you're on this contract basis, how are you paid?
It's variable. Some places, like the club jobs, predominantly would pay you a cash out at the end of the night. And then any other form is usually check. Unless you work like as a courtesy officer for an apartment, then they might give you an apartment as compensation.
Okay. Have you ever worked as a courtesy officer for an apartment complex?
I have.
Okay. And is that 24-hour service at the apartment?
Yeah, it's a unique arrangement. The officer will provide certain courtesies for the complex, i.e. maybe light checks, doing property walks in uniform for the visibility, and then of course handling any criminal matters on there in exchange for they basically get to have your cell phone number or your pager, and well, back in the day it was a pager, and they can call upon you as needed.
Okay. What has been your understanding when these types of businesses have requested your services as to the reason they're requesting your presence?
It's mainly to enforce all of the applicable laws. If they want us to address all of the criminal activities. So if they're experiencing a rash of burglaries in the apartments, we try to deter that if we can. If not, we try to help with the investigation if we can. Most complexes have a lot of problems with people that come and trespass on their property. Unauthorized occupants that come onto the property for whatever the reason. It's our job to investigate that, and if there's cause for charges, then we'll follow those charges. If people are engaging in narcotics activity, we try to address that. It's anything in between.
And what is your understanding, if you have one at all, of why your services as an off-duty Houston police officer would be requested over that of a private security firm?
I think it's because And, you know, part of our duties also working for complexes is we have the command presence and the visibility of the uniform. Being police officers, I think it gets the message out there that if somebody breaks the law, then we can certainly enforce that. And so I think the benefit of having police officers perform those duties versus a private security company is, you know, we act as police officers while we're there. We're not just going to stick to the property per se. You know, if we on-view something in the street right there on the edge of the property, we're bound to act. We can enforce that as well. But I think it's just a level of enforcement and deterrence that comes with a uniformed police officer versus a security company.
Okay. And you mentioned your uniform a couple of times. Are you required to wear your HPD-issued uniform while you're on an extra job?
We are. We are required to wear an approved department-issued uniform while we work these kinds of jobs.
Okay. Are you also carrying a weapon when you're doing the extra jobs?
We carry everything that we use at work is what we use at the extra jobs.
Okay.
It's the same, it's a parity, it's the same difference, if you will.
Okay, so let's say you were on duty and patrolling at an apartment complex. What would you carry on your person?
If I was conducting a patrol through apartment complex on duty outside of the marked vehicle, that's the only thing we don't take to extra jobs, okay? I would have everything else. I would have my duty belt, which would include my service weapon, extra ammunition, handcuff case, my radio holder, taser. That's what I typically carry.
Okay, and inside of your vehicle, are you carrying anything additionally?
Other than other tools, like if we're doing a ticket rider or something like that, things that would be just specific to the patrol function, I guess,
Okay.
on duty. But I mean, there's some officers that in their patrol vehicle, you know, if they're certified, they carry their assault rifles. They may or may not carry that to their extra job. But for
Okay.
the most part, what we wear to work every day is what we're going to the extra job in.
Okay, so on duty or off duty,
Same difference.
same difference. You have to wear your uniform, and all the things you just testified to carrying as an on-duty officer, you carry as well as an off-duty officer?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. That includes your weapon?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, is that weapon one that is issued by HPD, or is that one that you provide for work purposes?
So the department regulates what kind of handguns we can purchase, but we actually purchase them.
Okay.
So there's a list. We can choose from the list, and then upon purchasing, before we carry it, we have to get certified, or we have to get qualified with it. That's a better word.
Okay. And you mentioned the increased security presence when you're at these extra jobs in your uniform. Is it your understanding that there's a reliance on your training as an officer as to the reason behind hiring you versus a private security company?
Objection leading.
Okay, well, I think that I do. I mean, I think that there's probably perceivable more credibility, just totally based on the number of hours of training that we get versus a private security company. It's my understanding a commissioned security guard only requires 32 or 40 hours. That's it.
Okay.
And coming out of the academy, I think we have well over 900 hours combined with the ongoing number of hours of field training.
Okay.
And then every year, the required mandatory training.
And so there's a big difference between the training that you as an HPD licensed peace officer obtains versus that of just a commissioned security guard?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, how do you actually obtain permission to work an extra job?
Okay, so the process is, once whatever the interest, if an officer gets approached about working your next job, the officer has to fill out an extra employment application. Okay, this currently is done on the computer system, but we fill out the application and it gets submitted to our immediate supervisor. If our immediate supervisor approves it, it gets forwarded to we have an extra employment division or office, and they're ultimately the authority on approving that application.
Okay. You mentioned that it sounded like you mentioned there may be a scenario where the officer actually applies for the permit or has been contacted for the extra job.
Well, like in this case, I was contacted by Officer Prowsey, who at the time was coordinating any police or security measures for the property. Mm-hmm. And so he asked me, hey, would you be interested in working this? And I said, sure, I'll help you out. And I filled out the application, EEO approved it, and then we began working it.
Okay, so there are instances where you're approached about working an off-duty job from internally.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I would say that's the majority of time. That's how we get referred to extra jobs internally. Every once in a while, you'll get somebody on the outside that says, "Hey, I have an event. I'm looking for some officers. Can you lead me in the right direction?"
Okay. And if that actually did happen, what would be your next step? If someone approached you and said, hey, listen, I got this fundraiser going on, do you think we can get some HPD officers out here? Or can we get you specifically?
Yeah, so if I was not available to work it for some reason, I would refer that individual to contact. The way I do it is I refer them to contact whatever station is responsible for policing their area.
Okay.
So even if it's, for example, if somebody approaches me, which has happened about jobs out in Harris County that's outside of HPD, I'll refer them to Harris County and say, hey, check with them, because I think it's more beneficial to have an officer that knows the area work the job than someone else.
Okay.
Just my personal thing. That's not a standard.
I understand. Now, you just mentioned how the process started with La Estancia Apartments. Am I correct in understanding you when you said you were first contacted by the coordinator and asked whether or not you'd be interested in this extra job? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And the coordinator at that time, was that Mike Prowsey?
That was.
Okay. After he asked you, what steps did you have to take in order to be able to actually work the job?
Well, the first thing I did is get the information needed to complete the application. So he provided me with the contact person, the location, name of the property, etc. Fill out the application, submitted a text for employment, and then upon approval of that permit. Well, actually, our only requirement is we can submit a permit. As long as we submit the permit, you can technically work the event, okay, before it gets approved. But most cases, what we do is we wait for that approval. Okay. Okay, and it's pretty quick.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
When you're submitting your application or your permit application, have you already been advised of how you would be paid?
Usually that's worked out. Yeah. Like the rate, it's going to come by check. This is what the turnaround time might be. Yes, that's all is negotiated up front. Okay.
And so what was the, well, let me go back. And you testified to this earlier, so I'm just trying to make sure that I have the dates down. When do you recall actually starting to work this extra job for La Estancia Apartments?
I don't remember the first occasion. I remember I obtained the permit, which included the address. The very original permit, I believe, was around April of 2013.
Okay.
And I do believe I worked it a number of times before the end of 2013.
Okay.
Now, I don't know if I started the first time in April or May, but I believe that I did work it during the 2013 year.
Okay, so let's start with the 2013 year. Do you recall how much you were being paid at that time?
Well, so he works out, each complex has a budget of what they want to spend on their off-duty police. Mike Prowsey kind of handles that. But our hourly rate boils down to $40 an hour for every hour that we're out there.
Okay.
Okay. The negotiations as far as scheduling was left to be spontaneous because naturally most businesses can't afford to keep off-duty police 24/7, and so whatever their budget was would dictate how many days or hours, if you will, we would be out there. And so we kind of had that month to try to accomplish that. Now there was occasions where we fell short of budget, right? We didn't get out there as much, and that's only because we have to work around our on-duty schedule. So if we have mandatory overtime or something like that, or that comes into play, then we're probably working the extra jobs a little bit less.
Okay.
We get out there when we can, and then try to meet the needs of the complex also.
Okay. Now, when you submitted this permit application and accepted this extra employment with La Estancia, were you considered an employee of La Estancia, or were you still considered an employee of the Houston Police Department?
We were not considered employees of La Estancia. We were considered employees of the Houston Police Department.
Okay. So I believe that part of this exhibit was entered earlier as maybe Exhibit 2. There, right in front of you, is that one right on top?
Here?
Mm-hmm. Is that Exhibit 2?
It is.
Okay. And what number are we at?
5.
5. Okay. Can I have a sticker, please? And if you could look at the bottom of Exhibit 2 there, what's the Bates range number at the bottom right-hand side? Very bottom says starts with COH Flores.
000248.
Okay. So I'm handing you what's been marked as Exhibit 5, and it starts with Bates number.
I have it.
Okay. Bates number 246, and it goes through 249.
Okay. Thank you.
And there are 2 permit applications in that exhibit, Exhibit 5. It contains the one that you reviewed in Exhibit 2, but it also contains an additional permit. And as the applicant employee numbers are redacted, I don't know which one applied to either you or Officer Harris. Therefore, I've combined them into Exhibit 5.
Okay.
I'd like for you to look at that exhibit and tell me what is that exhibit?
This is a photocopy of the extra employment permit application that we fill out
Okay.
to work an extra job.
And at the top of that document, the business name for which this permit application was submitted for, what is the business name?
On this page that I'm looking at, it was Guardian Equity Management.
Okay. And the date it was submitted, what is indicated?
March 28th of 2015.
Okay. And I believe you testified earlier that every year a new permit has to be submitted. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So just because we see March 28th, 2015 on this permit doesn't mean that's when the extra job started.
That's correct.
Okay. I also see the coordinate officer listed as Mike Prowsey, or M. Prowsey.
That's correct.
Is that the Mike Prowsey we've been discussing?
That is.
Okay. And as far as what's listed with respect to duty performed, what was the duty to be performed under this permit?
Let me Let's see what that's at on here. Oh,
It's under-
duty performed at the top.
Yes.
Enforce federal, state, and local laws while conducting patrols of the property.
Okay. And underneath, right underneath there, it says dress code. What was the dress code?
Uniform.
Okay. And underneath schedule information, that section right there in the middle,
Yes, ma'am.
there's a delineation between whether or not the extra job is police related or non-police related. What was marked for this permit application?
Police related.
Okay. And how often do your does the time range in which an off-duty job lasts, can that vary?
It can.
Okay. What would be considered temporary?
Anything less than 30 days.
Okay. And what would be considered permanent?
Anything over 30 days.
Okay. And on this permit application, this extra job was listed as what? Permanent or temporary?
Well, I'm sure it was permanent, but let me look and see just to confirm that. Anytime I take on a job like this, it's always going to be permanent. So yes, I marked permanent.
Okay. And under the comment section, it says explain your duties in detail. What are the duties in detail listed as?
Okay, so what we have here is we will conduct roving patrols as needed or directed between the following properties, which are all operated by Guardian Equity Management. And then we have a colon, and then we list all the properties that we may or may not work at.
Okay.
Okay, as I stated earlier, in this case we fill it out just to cover in case, because we're being directed usually by the coordinator where to go. And so we got it on there in case he needed us to go to a location, but we would typically have regular locations
Okay.
to go to.
Now, do you see listed there the address for La Estancia Apartments?
I do.
Okay, and what's that address listed?
6200 Gulfton.
Okay. And then if you'll turn the page with me
Yes, ma'am.
to Bates Bates page number 247. Is there a contact person listed?
Yes, ma'am.
And what's that person's name?
Jimmy Lee or Jimmy Leah Conway,
Okay. And what's her title listed as?
manager.
Okay. And so, did this Exhibit 5 represent the permit that, in accordance with HPD policy, that was submitted about or around the time in which this incident on July 22nd, 2015 occurred?
I'm sorry, you're asking if this permit was related?
Yeah,
was
if this
approved?
permit was in effect.
Yes, it was.
Poor question. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I got distracted there for a minute. Yeah, this permit was in effect at the time of this incident.
Okay. Now, after you submitted this application and started working for La Estancia, were there any policies and procedures from La Estancia apartment complex or Guardian Equity Management provided to you
No, ma'am.
before you started your job? Okay. Was there any training provided by either the apartment complex or Guardian Equity Management provided to you to assist you with completing your job?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Was it your understanding that while you were working this off-duty job for La Estancia, that you would rely on your training and experience in actually securing or patrolling the complex?
We would rely on the training experience, the training from the police department. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And was it also your understanding from the permit that you were there not to enforce any laws or regulations that La Estancia or Guardian Equity Management may have had, but as the permit states, to enforce federal, state, and local laws while you were conducting patrols of the property?
Leading.
That's correct.
Okay. When you were patrolling La Estancia, were you required, as you testified earlier, to wear your HPD issued uniform?
Yes, we are required to wear a department issued uniform.
And I know you testified earlier that the amount of time that you would actually be at the complex varied because of one, budget, and then varying the time so that people couldn't suspect when you would arrive. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
But do you have a general idea of how often you may have actually patrolled at this particular complex, La Estancia?
It would depend on an interim period of time, if you will. So there may have been times where there could have been times where maybe we were out there 2 or 3 times a week for that month, and then the following month maybe once a week. If that, it would depend. One of the other, I call it a service, that Officer Prowsey kind of worked out with the complexes is he was kind of like the courtesy officer, if you will, for the management company. So if corporate or a property manager would contact him and it was on the list and he needed us to go over there as opposed to the regular complex we normally work, we would pull off and go over there. Okay, so that could happen, but that's why it made it variable. So there may have been times where, you know, the frequency during that given month may have been more so than the minimum.
Okay.
But he would make sure that there was coverage.
Okay.
Okay.
And so in 2015, well, let's say before this incident happened on July 22nd, 2015, would it be a fair statement to say that you had patrolled at that particular complex on more than one occasion?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. In fact, would it also be fair to say that you had patrolled there on many occasions?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Many is a good way to categorize that. And let me just clarify for the record. Officer Prowsey would schedule weekly coverage, okay? And we weren't the only crew working the property, so there was other police officers. However, depending on other events, if we had work-related issues, we were working some kind of crime initiative which required overtime and we couldn't meet our schedule, he would try, like, so for example, if Officer Harris and I were scheduled to patrol the property that week, let's say 2 times that week, and we couldn't make one of those, he would attempt to try to get another crew to cover that.
Okay.
Okay, and that was in and around the spontaneity of if they were called about separate issues to go address.
Okay.
Okay.
So let's turn to the night or the day in question, July 22nd, 2015. What time, I believe you testified that you and Officer Harris arrived at the complex approximately around 6:30 p.m.?
That's what I remember, 6:30, 6:40, yeah, somewhere in that ballpark.
And was it still daylight when you arrived?
Yes.
Okay. What did you do upon first arriving at the apartment complex?
Okay, well, what I remember about this day is I believe the leasing office had already closed. I don't remember any specific instructions that Officer Prowsey had given us to be on the lookout for. So we began by doing a vehicular patrol of the property.
Okay.
And during this initial vehicular patrol is when we on-viewed this incident.
Okay. Now, if there would have been specific instructions from Prowsey, where would those specific instructions have come from?
Typically, the property manager will let him know.
Okay.
And that could be anything as, you know, hey, we've got some vacant units that people keep breaking into and just loitering in or poaching in or what have you. Can you go check these units and make sure there's nobody trespassing there? That could be an example of one of the issues.
So the apartment complex wouldn't call you directly to say, oh, we have these issues going on. That would be communicated to Prowsey first and not you first.
The standard was that, yes. There may have been an occasion if Officer Prowsey was out on vacation or something and he might have asked, hey, I'm going to be out. Can I give them your phone number to call since I'm going to be out that week? but the standard was everything went through Officer Prowsey.
Okay, all communications between the apartment complex and you as the officers,
For the most part.
for the most part,
That was the routine.
went through Mike Prowsey.
Yes, ma'am.
And he was the off-duty or extra-duty job coordinator.
That's correct.
Okay. Um, okay, so the first thing you all did when you arrived at the apartment complex was you did a vehicular inspection. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And that is when you first initially observed the three individuals.
That's correct.
Okay. You've already testified that you didn't initially observe the three guys. It was Officer Harris that brought your attention to their behavior as they were in the parking lot. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And you've already testified that it was, you guys had kind of stopped in the parking lot and were observing them as they were, appeared to be in a heated argument.
Objection.
Is that also correct?
That is
Leading.
correct.
Okay. And tell the jury, after you have had the observation that they appeared to be in some kind of argument amongst each other, what you did next.
Okay. So, as you just stated, we were doing a vehicular patrol. It was our initial patrol. When we do these patrols, we're usually driving very slowly through the property. As we made, I would say, what I would consider maybe 3/4 of the property on the inside, and we were coming around to the far east parking lot corridor. Officer Harris alerted me to the three individuals in this incident, and I don't remember the literal terminology. I don't know if he said something's up or that looks kind of funny, but he brought it to my attention, and then I began looking, and I think he asked me something along the lines of, "What do you think they're doing?" And in further discussion, it appeared as though, based on their behavior, our observations of their behavior, it appeared as though they might be in some kind of conflict, an argument, a dispute amongst themselves.
Objection. Calls for speculation. Okay.
At that point, we had some suspicion just to monitor it, at the very least, just to make sure that they didn't assault each other.
Okay, so at that moment, you had reasonable suspicion that something was occurring. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And please continue with what you observed.
Okay, so we felt we needed to continue to monitor it. They began initially walking at a fast pace southbound through that east parking lot corridor, and as they continued to walk, their pace increased. At one point, it got to like what I would call a slow trot before it got up to a run. So, additionally, there was other things that we observed. There were some furtive movements, looking around as if to avoid detection of some kind or to see if somebody was coming. And then their body language, based on my experience in this job after 20 years, was consistent with that of somebody moving in a direction with a sense of purpose. That enhanced our reasonable suspicion.
Okay.
Okay. At one point, Officer Harris saw Mr. Flores squat, duck down, whatever you want to call it, and reach for something. Because I remember the initial alerts was, hey, watch his hands. He'd reach for something. So, again, adding to the already existent reasonable suspicion, we stayed with this. Initially, they were all. So you have a what I call a parking lot corridor where the vehicles drive. To the left of us were the actual parking spaces. They were initially on my side, that side, as they were going. Just seconds before Mr. Flores pointed the gun at my partner, he branched off from those two. So the two individuals stayed on the left, my side, and Mr. Flores ran what I would describe as a wide right in front of us. Officer Harris kept us focused on that. I remember hearing him just, hey, watch out, watch out, watch out. At the same time, I'm trying to focus on what these two are doing. But at some point after the squat, when he said, hey, be careful, he's reaching for something, and prior to him pointing the gun at Officer Harris, he had pulled the gun out and took what we would describe as a tactical running approach towards something. So at that point,
if I may interrupt, the reasonable suspicion that you initially had when just seeing them appear to be in some kind of argument amongst themselves has heightened all the way to the point where now you're seeing a weapon being pulled.
Yes, and let me just clarify, the manner in which Mr. Flores pulled a weapon out was not consistent, based on my experience and training, with that of a, let's say, a person licensed to carry a firearm.
Okay.
Okay. He pulled it out again with his body language and the movements. At that point, I felt that we felt that a crime was about to occur, and that we had cause to take action.
Okay. And so from that point, tell us what happened after you saw that cause for immediate concern of a crime being about to be committed.
Officer Harris saw the gun first before me. As Mr. Flores ran out on a wide right and was coming back left in front of the vehicle, when they first split up, we pulled up. Tommy had already seen the gun. I was trying to stop the car. We stopped the car. We got our doors open. As we're stepping out, because at this point they had split up, we had what I would consider a split threat. And so I kept my visual on the two individuals that ran to the left behind, if I may use this, please, this truck right here.
Okay.
So initially, when we were getting out of the vehicle, the two individuals were standing at the back of the truck where I could see them clearly. As Officer Harris and I exited the vehicle and identified ourselves as police officers, at that point my focus was on those two. Mr. Vargas, I believe, I specifically remember his eyes. When he looked at me, his eyes widened. They got big, kind of like a deer in the headlight look. And that's because I believe at that point he realized that Houston police officers were there. He and the other individual ran behind the truck, so I kept focus on that. Keep in mind, this is a rapidly evolving, spontaneous situation, so some of this is going on simultaneously. But as I'm trying to keep focus on that, I can hear Officer Harris alerting me to the gun. And then I heard him say he's got a gun. I heard him identify himself loudly and clearly as a Houston police officer, dropped the gun. And at that point I was bringing my attention back because he confirmed that this guy's got a gun. As I brought my attention back to Mr. Flores, I remember seeing the gun like this, and what I specifically remember seeing about that gun is that the cylinder of the gun appeared larger than it was. Okay, it looked very big, and that's the most distinctive recollection that I have. At that point, I saw that he was definitely armed with a revolver.
Okay.
But as I'm coming back to get my eyes on that, and Officer Harris already given the commands, Officer Harris, responded to Mr. Flores' threat of force, and used his firearm. And I remember hearing 3 shots.
Okay.
After the shots were fired, Mr. Flores had a momentum at this point. He was doing a good run. He continued to run. We both, after talking about it later, we both recollected that we didn't even know if he'd been hit. But we were concerned that an individual with a gun was getting away from us. So we went around that truck, and when we came around the truck, we saw the handgun on the ground, which was, the barrel had been removed. And then we saw Mr. Flores and we saw Mr. Vargas at the truck. I had already seen the third gentleman that I know is Mr. Cruz or whatever jump over the sidewalk and run off. So I knew he wasn't there, but I knew that Mr. Vargas hadn't left yet. And so, you know, at that point we did our very best to quickly secure the scene and get him immediate medical attention because I could see that he was injured.
And do you know who called 911?
Officer Harris got on his off-duty radio, advised the dispatcher that shots had been fired and that we needed an ambulance.
Okay. And do you recall how long it took approximately for first responders to show up?
It seemed like they got there within minutes. That's what I remember. I couldn't tell you an exact number of what the response time was, but I remember they got there pretty quick.
And when you say it was imminent for you guys to secure the scene, did that include also handcuffing Mr. Flores while you waited for first responders to appear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. After all of this happened, you took us through earlier that other officers arrived on scene and you and Officer Harris were separated into separate police cars. At any point in time, were you required to write a report for the complex on the incident that had occurred?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Even if it weren't while you were still on the scene, at any point during the course of the investigation, were you required to write a report for the apartment complex?
No, ma'am.
Okay. The only, because you were off-duty officers, you actually weren't required to write up a report on this incident. Is that correct?
For the department?
Yes.
Objection leading.
No, well, okay. Anytime that we effect an arrest, we write our own offense reports for the city. In this case, since we were the complainants, it's standard operating procedure for the homicide investigators to assume primary, and they will complete that report. And then any officer that was on that scene, doing whatever role they had, would do a supplement to that report.
Okay. And so in this instance, the only thing that you recall actually filling out is your statement for homicide.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
I have it now.
So I'm handing you what's been marked as Exhibit 6.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you recall, do you know what is identified or in that picture or in Exhibit 6?
That's a picture of me.
Okay. Do you know when this picture was taken?
This was taken the day of the incident.
Okay. So you were wearing, it looks like is this a Kevlar vest with police around it?
That's correct.
Okay. And your badge that's hanging down around your neck?
Yes, ma'am. That's correct.
And so you said this is what you were wearing at the time this incident occurred?
Yes, ma'am.
So when you got out of the vehicle, as you testified earlier, then you would have been wearing this uniform that identified you as a police officer?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And was it still daylight when you got out of the vehicle?
Yes, at the time of the incident, it was complete daylight.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you were asked earlier about whether or not one could have been able to identify whether or not you were a police officer at the time of this incident, is it a fair statement to say that if you got out in this uniform that's depicted in Exhibit 6 that they would have seen that you were a police officer?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in this uniform. There's no doubt in my mind that all three of those individuals had full knowledge of who we both were.
Objection. Objection. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So my uniform obviously indicating in large reflective lettering police, but even the standard uniform issue, I mean, most people know what the Houston police uniform looks like, just from seeing it on the news, seeing officers out in public. Although there may not be an insignia on the front of the standard uniform saying police, you can see the badge, you can see parts of the shoulder patches that indicate Houston Police.
And your recollection from the series of events that occurred is that Officer Harris alerted you to the fact that the plaintiff had a gun in his possession. Is that correct?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And is it also your recollection?
defendant.
I'm sorry, Jen?
Plaintiff. I think you said plaintiff, right? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
And is it also your recollection that Officer Harris identified himself to the plaintiff, Helder Flores, before he discharged his weapon as a police officer?
Loudly and clearly with a command presence, command voice presence.
And this was after he had already observed the gun in Flores' possession.
Leading.
Is that correct?
Leading.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, he initially spotted the gun, okay, and then when he alerted me to the fact that he had that gun, when I drew my attention back to him, I also saw the gun.
Okay.
But yes, he identified himself loudly and clearly as a police officer.
And was Officer Harris also wearing a standard HPD uniform?
He was.
Earlier you testified that La Estancia was an area well known for gang activity and high crime. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And was that, in fact, part of the reason why you were hired to actually patrol the La Estancia apartment?
Yes, ma'am.
It was an effort to curtail some of the crime that was occurring in the area.
That's correct.
And did that also include gang activity by the Southwest Cholos?
Yes, ma'am.
Objection. Leading.
Were you ever directed by La Estancia Apartments to hone in on the Southwest Cholos?
No, ma'am, not specifically. No, we were just told about ongoing criminal activity that was occurring in the area, which was affecting their complex, and that's why they wanted us there to try to do something about it. They weren't specific about any gang.
Okay. Were they specific about any particular type of criminals? For instance, were they specific about keep an eye out on Hispanic males on the property?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Any specific requests to keep an eye out on any African American males on the property?
No, ma'am.
Any specific direction towards any racial, any ethnic female on the property that you needed to have heightened alert about?
No, ma'am. In general, the communications that would occur would be directed towards or in response to criminal problems they were having. For example, trespassing, people cutting through the property, engaging in narcotics activity, things of that nature. There was never any specific instructions to follow any certain race or group of people or anything of that nature. Okay. Now, if they had a specific individual, like for example, that they had evicted from the property per se, and I can't recall of one where they say, hey, we're worried about this individual coming back, they might alert Officer Prowsey to be on the lookout, only to state that this person's gone through full eviction and does not have permission to be on the property.
Okay. So if I understand you correctly, you were there to identify or target specific criminal conduct, not specific people.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, you also testified earlier that there would be times where you would patrol the property and the front office would still be open.
Yes, ma'am.
And you would go in and check in with the manager.
That's correct.
Do you recall whether or not you actually spoke with a manager, or was it just an employee in the office?
Yeah, it's taken literally. I mean, we would always ask if the manager was there, but if not, any representative of management is who we would check with.
Okay.
And it was usually along the lines of, hey, do you have anything for us?
Okay.
You know, criminally speaking.
Okay. When you did those check-ins, were there ever any occasions where any of the employees that you spoke to gave you directions on how you needed to perform your duties while you were there?
No, that's never happened. I can tell you this, in my 23 years, the only time we've ever had someone at a club job, we had an individual that wanted, it was a two-man job, and he wanted one officer at the front door and one officer on the side door, and due to the amount of people, we advised him we're not separating. So, but in relation to this incident at this complex, they never asked, nor implied, nor inferenced, anything like that. I think Officer Prowsey made it clear that when they hire us, we operate the way we operate, and we're going to handle our business the way that we were trained by the police department.
Okay, so at no point in time were you ever given any directions on how to perform your job. You may be given indications of issues that may be going on the property?
That's correct.
He has 5 minutes.
We'll just go ahead and go off the record now so that the videographer can change the tape.
This is the end of Media 4. The time is 3:11 p.m. We're off the record.